I'm not 100% sure how to pronounce today's topic. Motifs? 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 If the pronunciation of today's topic is wrong or sounds different from what you were expecting it to be, then I apologize. Luckily, this is purely a text-based medium, so the pronunciation really doesn't matter. I thought we would cover this topic because we talked about themes last week, and this topic is closely related to themes. It also relates to things like tone and mood, but I haven't done a video on either of those things yet, so I'm just going to pretend like they don't exist. So let's talk about motifs, what they are, what they do, and how to incorporate one into your work. There are basically two criteria in order for a motif to be a motif. First, it must be an element that repeats repeatedly throughout the story in some form. Generally, to be recognized as a motif, this repeating element needs to be repeated often enough that the reader notices the repetition. Repeatedly. A motif also needs to reinforce the theme of the story in some way. It should have some deeper symbolic meaning that links back to the theme. Beyond those two criteria, the repetition and linking back or reinforcing the theme in some way, a motif can be virtually anything. Any concrete, recurring story element that you can present to the reader, such as a piece of visual imagery, an object, a line of dialogue, a repeating sound. So long as it repeats and reinforces the theme in some meaningful way, then you can basically use anything for a motif. Now I want to briefly talk about the difference between symbols and motifs. These two literary devices are closely related, but there's some key differences. A symbol is a one-time device used to show the reader some abstract idea in a more concrete way. If you use the same symbol multiple times in a story, it doesn't necessarily turn it into a motif, unless it ties back to the theme. Now that I've just said what the purpose of a motif is, let's talk about the purpose of a motif. Motifs are primarily used as a way to link the concrete world of the narrative to the abstract meaning of the theme. I talked last week during the themes video about how themes are not generally explicitly communicated to the reader, but instead communicated subconsciously. This presents some difficulties because communicating things consciously is much easier to do. The motif is one of the best ways to get around this. It's an easy way to communicate the theme to the reader. There are other literary devices that can accomplish the same thing, but a motif is at the top of the list and by far the most commonly used. And that's really all a motif is meant to do. This is really a fairly simple concept, but one that is very important and offers you, the writer, a lot of flexibility. So how can you incorporate a motif into your own work? First of all, if you haven't settled on your theme yet, you need to do that first. It's hard to work in a motif without first knowing what theme it is you're trying to reinforce. Go back and watch the theme video from last week, which I will most likely forget to link to, if you want some advice on how to come up with your theme. Once you've settled on your theme, there's a couple of different ways that you can go about adding in a motif. Similar to the theme, a motif can be something that you consciously add to the story or something that arises naturally out of the writing. Think about the setting, characters, and action in the story. Is there an element that repeats itself throughout that could somehow be tied back to the theme? Depending on your style, you might already be using certain elements that would lend themselves to being a motif in a way to imply things about a character's emotional state or their feelings about a particular situation. If you're doing that already, then you likely have most of a motif already in place. This type of repetition and symmetry is a very appealing part of a lot of stories and something that many people do without thinking about it. And it's also a place where you can get a motif. The other approach is to consciously add one into your story. What you choose as a motif and what theme you're linking back to is, of course, going to vary from story to story. I mentioned before that nearly any recurring concrete detail can be used as a motif, so there's nearly endless possibilities out there. You do want to be careful, though, not to overdo it on the symbolism, regardless of whether you consciously add a motif or one just naturally appears before you. This is part of a bigger discussion on symbolism that should maybe be talked about in another video, but basically you want to hit the sweet spot between not repeating enough that the reader doesn't notice, but also not repeating so much that they get annoyed. Just like you're probably annoyed that this video is ending, or annoyed that I used that same joke a while ago, I think, to transition to the conclusion. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video and found the advice in it useful. If you want to see more stuff like this, you can check out all my other writing advice related videos and subscribe to my channel. The delivery of that line was kind of stilted and weird, don't know why. I post new videos every Wednesday. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.